In this video, I want to talk about when you should go big. When should you throw bigger than average baits to catch not only bigger than average bass, but also just average bass? Because I think that there is a time and a place for this. I think for a lot of anglers, we think about whenever we should throw big baits is when we are around big fish. If you're fishing a pond or a lake or a river that has big fish in it, like big bass in it, that's when you should throw baits. And that's 100% correct. I mean, that's an obvious one that I think all of us can think about. But in this video, I want to talk about a few more unobvious situations where actually just throwing a bigger bait may just help you to get more bites. They may not always be bigger, they may just be more bites. And then there are times where it will help you to catch kind of that bigger than average fish on your body of water, whether that's a 3-pounder or a 10-pounder. But before we get into the video, guys, I do want you to know that this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. Right now, if you buy one of my USA-made sun shirts, they're one of the only USA-made sun shirts out there on the market, you can get one of my bass hats with a wood patch on it for 50% off. So it's kind of a combo deal that I'm running for the month of March. All you got to do is add the shirt to cart, add the hat that you like to cart. It will automatically discount at checkout, and it really helps support this channel. Now, let's talk a little bit about going big. And the first thing that I kind of want to define is what going big actually means, because depending on where you live in the country, this can mean a number of different things. I mean, going big in places like Texas, Florida, California, I mean, you're talking about maybe a 10, 11, 12-inch swim bait. That's really big. But for a lot of Midwest, northern anglers, throwing an 11-inch bait, a 10-inch bait, I mean, it honestly just doesn't make sense for us. Yeah, you might be able to catch a fish here and there with it, but you're not going to go out there and catch a lot of fish. And so going big for a lot of us might mean kind of more in that 6 to 7 to 8-inch swim bait range. And I'm also not always talking about a swim bait. You know, another way for us to go big is by simply upsizing the soft plastics that we are using on rigs like a Texas rig, for example. You know, for me, if you've listened to this channel, I love to fish a big Texas rig worm. It's one of my absolute favorite things to do. I fished a Zoom Old Monster for a number of years. This is a worm that I'm going to experiment a lot with this year. This is an X-Zone lure. It's an 11-inch bait, so it's a little bit bigger than the Zoom Old Monster, but what I like about it is kind of has that skinnier profile to it. So I feel like it's a bait that'll get a lot of bites and catch a lot of fish. It could also mean going with a bigger jig than you're kind of used to. You know, for example, I live in Ohio, and a lot of guys around here, you know, if we're fishing jigs, we're fishing a lot of finesse jigs, a lot of, 1/4 ounce to 3/8 ounce jigs. Typically, they are pretty compact. But sometimes simply going big means stepping up to a 1/2 ounce or a 5/8 ounce jig, and you kind of leave the trailer long. Maybe you put a 4 or 5-inch piece of plastic on there. That's a big presence for a lot of the fish that are in our general area, and maybe in your general area. So going big can look very different depending on where you live in the country. But the big thing that I want to stress is that there is a spot where it's too big, where something is too big. Kind of like I alluded to a minute ago. You know, if you're fishing in Minnesota and you're throwing a 10, 12-inch bait, you're talking about the top end of your bass being 6 pounds, 7 pounds maybe. I mean, it's just like here in Ohio. Although our record for Ohio is 13 pounds, which is a completely bizarre fish, the majority of our lakes, like you're talking about 7, 8 pounds being the top end of a lot of the big fish that are around here. So what I kind of have learned over the years is there's definitely too big of a bait to throw, where you're swinging for the fence and you're not going to catch anything. And I just heard this, even like it was reinforced in my brain on a Chris Zaldain podcast that I listened to here just recently. They were talking with Steve Kennedy all about big baits. And Steve Kennedy, Chris Zaldain, these are professional anglers that travel the world, the country, to catch bass. And they even themselves said that, when you are tournament fishing, it's hard to get bit on baits that are kind of over the 8-inch range. Are there guys that do it? 100%. Are there fisheries where that sets up right? 100%. But for the majority of us, when we're talking about big baits, we're talking about 7-inch baits like this Spro KGB Chad that I'm holding here, or a 6-inch bait like this. This is actually a Spro. This is also a Spro. This is the Megalojohn swim bait. This is another one right here. Bass Pro Shop just re-released the XPS swim bait. This was really what started the whole mag draft phase. And this is kind of that 6-inch bait. That, to me, that 6 to 7-inch bait range is kind of going big while still going out and trying to catch numbers of fish, especially if you're a tournament fisherman and you want to try to catch 5 fish in a day. Now, with all of that being said, there are a few unobvious situations that I feel like going big is really, really key to catching fish. Just fish, period. And one of those is when you are fishing in highly pressured situations. I've talked about this a little bit on the channel, but when you are fishing in bodies of water that have a lot of pressure on them, you see guys out there throwing everything. What tends to happen is guys, I feel like, tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Guys go from fishing jigs to fishing, maybe crankbaits, to fishing Texas rigs, to fishing Ned rigs, and they just keep getting smaller and smaller. And while that does tend to allude to more bites, sometimes going bigger in those highly pressured situations, you're going to show a fish something that they have not seen for a long time. And that can be the true difference into actually triggering bites. And I'm not just talking about catching fish that are bigger than average for that system of that body of water you're fishing. I'm talking about just catching fish, catching average fish. I mean, I've told this story often on Bass Fishing HQ on this channel, where I fished in a tournament here in Ohio, and everyone around me was fishing shaky heads. Like, everybody was fishing shaky heads on this bait, on this particular body of water. Me and a buddy, we decided to go the exact opposite way, and I threw a Zoom Old monster worm, so it's very similar to this X Zone 1, and my buddy was throwing a man's jelly worm, which is even bigger. It's like a 12-inch bait. And we did really well in a tournament where other guys couldn't even catch a limit on shaky heads. Because why? We were doing something different. And just like that, a few years ago, I was fishing in another tournament. And everybody in the lake thought I was fishing chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, a lot of your typical springtime baits. This was kind of a pre-spawn time frame. I went behind a lot of those anglers fishing, not this bait, but a mag draft. It's just like this bait, but it's a Mega Bass mag draft. It's one of my favorite lures. You guys have heard this a lot. And I was able to catch fish behind guys. So when you are fishing in highly pressured situations, I think that it is so important at times to just upsize your baits. Try to upsize, try to show those bass something that they have not seen in a while or maybe never seen. And so sometimes that can really help you to just catch fish. And yeah, sometimes they're going to be big. Sometimes they're just the average fish in the lake that haven't seen what you are throwing. Now, the other time that I tend to throw bigger than average baits is in the post spawn. No matter where you live in the country, I think that in the post spawn, the biggest females in the body of water that you are fishing seek out some of the biggest bait to eat. Now, this could be, a big topwater bait. This could be a big swim bait mimicking a shad. This could be, a really big swim jig that kind of imitates a bluegill that is maybe on a bluegill bed. I see it time and time again during the post spawn as when you see some of these really big largemouth bite. Now, the only thing about the post spawn is that you will catch 5 and 6 pounders that have the frame of a 7 or 8 pounder, but they're just not fat. But they are still some of the biggest fish in the body of water that you are fishing. So I think that during the post spawn, when I know that the fish are off the beds, I always have some big baits rigged up, because what happens a lot of times is those bass go up on beds and, a female may not eat anything for several days. And even a week at times, if maybe they're actively laying eggs on a number of different beds. So when they get done with all that, they're hungry. And I have seen their days on the water where a you could throw a normal size, we'll say a 4-inch swim bait at a bass. You know, actually I've seen it more with topwaters. I've seen days where you could throw kind of your typical topwater, maybe a popper, maybe like a 3-4 inch walking style bait, and a fish will not hit it. But if you throw a big walking style bait, a big 6-inch bait, something that is just a little bit oversized, you'll have fish come up there and crush that thing, and it's simply because of the bigger profile. So guys, I just want to talk in this video about a few kind of under the radar times where I like to throw big baits. And like I talked about, there's a number of them that I like to throw. You guys know that I love this KGB Chad Shad. This is not the original KGB because that's like $250. This is a Spro version. I'll leave a link for all this stuff down below. You guys know I like a mag draft swim bait. I actually have a really interesting video coming on BassFishingHQ later in this week where I compare a lot of these 6-inch style swim baits. So guys, I hope that this video helps you. Just remember this when you're out there on the water. I like to have a couple of big baits almost with me all the time anymore now, but hopefully this helps you to catch fish and catch a big one. I will see you guys tomorrow.